as you probably know, whenever linguistics is at play, there are many theories about whatever phenomenon it might be, and also a bunch of opinions, which may or may not be good. So gender is no exception. Theories and opinions about it kind of abound, and they've gone back for a while historically as well. Gender, at least historically, is thought of as sort of like a mysterious feature, since it appears on inanimate nouns as well as animate nouns. People kind of wonder, like, what does it mean? Can we unify what gender is supposed to be doing, what it's for, what it means? And it goes back at least to William of Ockham and says that's arbitrary and meaningless. There's no means to gender at all. Whether a noun gets in like German or something gets feminine or masculine or neuter just seems to be sort of like the luck of the draw. Similarly, Bloomfield, one of the fathers of linguistics, if you trace the Chomsky line, for example, back, it hits Bloomfield, not too many steps. He said that there's no practical or obvious criteria for determining gender. And at least for me, I can attest to the last one. It's really hard for second language learners to learn gender in new languages. There's also some, of course, actual research on this. Other people have said various other mysterious things about it. So perhaps gender is creative. It gives you some kind of additional layer of meaning on top of a noun that isn't particularly necessarily related to its precise like reference. So if a table is feminine, maybe there's some sort of creative relation to femininity that's happening. Some also have shown or argued, at least like this paper by Maldi et al. From 2015, that the gender marking itself facilitates communicative efficiency in some way, perhaps by adding some layer of redundancy. And there's a bunch of research from psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics that show the gender marking itself is important for online processing. So if you mark a noun, say, with the wrong gender, people will get really confused. If you maybe like ablate portions of the concord of gender, so how it spreads across the noun phrase, people will have a harder time processing the sentence. And it seems to speed up processing in languages that have it. So it seems like there's tons of conflicting ideas going around. And the main, I guess, contrast in these ideas that I want to pick out is, does gender mean something or doesn't it? Is the relationship arbitrary or is it meaningful? And generally when there's some sort of complete conflict like this in linguistics, it's because there's some generalization that has been missed. And you probably can guess what the generalization is, at least so far, but Corbett has a really good way of pointing to it. I kind of hinted at it earlier, which is that the contribution of gender to semantics or to the meaning is clearer for animates than inanimates. So in languages that mark gender, human nouns get marked with gender or any animate noun, and that marking generally reflects the gender identity of the person, or in the case of like an animal, the biological sex of that animal. So this slide just to make sure we're on the same page with what I mean by gender, what I mean by concord. So this is an example from Spanish. These are two cats. You know, I know these cats, and I know that one is a male cat and one's a female cat. This brown one is a male. If I'm referring to them, the way that the word is actually pronounced referring to these different animals will be different. So if it's a male, the noun gato for cat will reflect the maleness on this O. And if it's a female, gata will reflect the femaleness on this A. And if I'm referring to these creatures, even saying the same thing about them, like the small cat, he or she is cute, you can see that the biological sex of the animal will like reflect across the entire utterance. So it'll appear on determiners like el versus la, on adjectives, pequeño versus pequeña, pronouns like el versus ella, and then again, adjectives like lindo and linda for cute. So it really does matter in these languages what the biological sex of this animal is. You need to know it to correctly say these things about these cats. So it's clear here, at least, that there is meaning, a direct relationship between some sort of meaning, biological sex, and the grammatical structure of the sentence. Another reason to argue that at least that gender is meaningful in some sense, taking the split of animate and inanimate as sort of an initial generalization, it's meaningful on animate, it's not meaningful on inanimate, is that humans are animate, and we obviously, our societies at least, care a lot about gender identity, and so it has deep social implications. We have to pay attention to it, and especially for NLP, these sort of implications have become more noticeable and have come to the fore in the last couple of years. So gender biases in NLP systems resulting from human gender have been found in like machine translation, captions, speech recognition, basically everywhere everyone looks. Word embeddings, the whole thing. This is from a somewhat recent literature review from, I think, 2 years ago now. Oof, time flies. But basically, anywhere that we talk about people, we're going to have these kind of gender biases in our systems. So it's clear that gender means something on animate human nouns. So obviously it means something. It can't be completely arbitrary, and at least it means something on animates. So the question is, if we want to just make that cut, the first generalization, meaningful on animates, not meaningful on inanimates, we can have to verify that second piece. So the question that this set of papers is going to address, or at least try to address, is the question of whether gender is meaningful on inanimate nouns just the same. We want to check whether there's any relationship between the grammatical gender on nouns and the lexical meanings of those nouns. And so that sort of relationship would be that like gender overlaps in meaning somehow, the sort of thing that we want to look for. And to do that, we need some proxy for the meaning of nouns. Like we all kind of know what nouns mean, but there's many different ways to like intuitively, we know what a cat is, we know what a pumpkin is, etc. But how to operationalize that into something that you can actually measure statistical significance on is a trickier proposition. So if we take kind of the generative linguistics approach, things like cat would be a property of animals that are cats, or like a function that given a cat will tell you whether the thing that was fed in was a cat or not. These things are hard to operationalize mathematically. So we're going to kind of go for a different, I think, complementary way of thinking about lexical semantics that's more quantifiable. Yeah, quantifiable. So let's dive into a little bit more about the intuitions behind the proxy that we used. So let's say with these 3 inanimate objects, we have a pumpkin, a moon, and a clock. How are we going to get at the meaning of these things? Well, we can think about how we describe them. So all 3 of those things are round. We can think about things that are different between them, other ways that we talk about them. The pumpkin is a food, the moon and the clock are not. The clock is made by humans, others are not made by humans. The moon will be around for a long, long time, but the clock and the pumpkin won't. Maybe the clock will be around longer than the pumpkin and less than the moon. There's various different options. And so when people talk about concepts, the way that they talk about them sort of reflects the meanings of those concepts. At least in some respect, we can zoom in particularly on properties of those concepts that they might share or not share. And properties across languages are usually or often realized as adjectives. So we can see that corpus co-occurrences of these different properties will differ. And in fact, the frequencies of the collocations of like adjectives and nouns will differ, sort of reflecting some lexical meaning of those things. So like all of them are things that can be round, but only some are things that can be handmade. And so one way to operationalize this is to look at corpus co-occurrences. So what if gender reflects some semantic properties of the object that are particularly salient for a given language? So let's say the way that people talk about pumpkins in Spanish and German are different. Then we might expect that the occurrences of different adjectives that go with the word pumpkin will also be different. So the distributions over adjectives which modify nouns, let's say nouns that are split into different genders, might semantically overlap with a noun gender. So it's possible that the gender on the particular noun will have some correlation with the types of adjectives that are used for that noun. And that's the sort of thing that we want to measure as our proxies of meaning. So how much do adjectives inform us about noun gender? That's the main question. And so if you're like listening to me talk about this, you might be thinking of other resonances in your head in the domain of linguistics, potentially the Harrison for a distributional hypothesis, right? You shall know a word by the company it keeps. I mean, in this particular thing, I'm talking just about adjectives, but that's sort of the underlying bedrock for a lot of the NLP tools that we all use today. So that's kind of an important resonance. Another resonance you might be thinking of, if you're on the more of the psycholinguistic side, is on Lara Boroditsky's experiments on adjective production. I just want to say a bit more on that one, so we're all in agreement. This work is part of a larger effort on neo-Worfian linguistics, for example. And basically, the Boroditsky claim is that gender on inanimates actually reflects something of the meaning that gender has on animates. So there might be some stereotypes about people which somehow get put onto objects. This is a bit of a crazy claim. At least I intuitively, at the first thinking of this initially, was like, what do you mean? Like, it seems a bit crazy. If you have a table in Spanish that's feminine, like, is there anything woman-like about that table? It seemed a bit crazy. But of course, it's worth kind of thinking about this intuitive idea a little more before immediately discounting it. Of course, tables, inanimate-like tables, don't have any natural gender. They don't have gender identities, clearly, because they're not conscious. There's not really a cultural relation between tables and people. It's hard to know what that would be. And another reason to think that there's not at least a standard relationship between stereotypes on people and inanimate objects is that languages will differ in which genders they assign to different concepts. The three examples I picked above, moon and pumpkin and clock, across Spanish and German, they have different genders on these three objects. So that's kind of why I picked them. So if there's some stereotype there, it must be specific as well to the culture. So the Boroditsky claim is one to contend with, even though it's a bit sketchy. Just to give it a bit more meat, I want to quote a paper by one of the students of Lara, and she's also in this et al., which is, we might expect entities without biological sex to acquire stereotypically masculine or feminine properties as a result of being assigned to a grammatical category. So this is actually even a stronger claim than I initially suggested. It's a causal claim. It says it suggests that because people in Spanish think of assign tables feminine, therefore we might expect that the table will acquire stereotypically feminine property. And what that means then is that people talk about tables in Spanish, they might use more stereotypically feminine adjectives. So they did a kind of pilot study. It's not peer reviewed. I think it's in like a book chapter or something, where they did an attempt at checking whether people have this behavior, whether they actually think about objects in this way. And what they did is they took bilinguals of, say, German and Spanish, and they presented them in each of their languages with nouns that differ in gender in those languages. So here's an example: bridge, it's feminine in German and masculine in Spanish. And they asked those people, when speaking German, say the first three adjectives you think go with this bridge. And when speaking Spanish, say first three adjectives that go with this bridge. And they found that they report that people will use more feminine stereotypic adjectives like elegant if the language marks that object as feminine, and masculine was like sturdy when the language marks it as masculine. So this suggests potentially some anecdotal evidence maybe in support of this claim. Of course, it's very sketchy, very intuitive. So then we kind of, taking this as an inspiration, perhaps, we can ask at a larger scale, maybe at a level of the whole corpus, can we find similar relationships? And then so that's the first step. How meaningful is gender on inanimate nouns? Restate the question. But the first step would be, is there any relationship at all between gender and the choice of adjective? And then secondarily, we can ask, following up on the Boroditsky assertion, is that relationship one of stereotypicality? So what we do is we try to quantify the amount of information in bits shared between gender on nouns and the adjectives that modify those nouns. So briefly, we selected sentences in a couple of languages, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Polish, and Russian. We selected these mainly because they were easy to access using Wikipedia, but it'd be great to extend beyond this soon. And we took sentences like this one: I want to cross a robust or a strong bridge. And we kind of ablated all of the gender information. So we replaced each verb or adjective with its lematized form, so the infinitival or the part without the final gender suffix, to basically remove all signs of overt morphological gender. And then we trained a parser to pull out the collocations, particularly the AMOD collocations for adjective and noun, to see what the relationship might be there. We also want to look at the relationship between verbs and nouns, because again, what the noun is constrains what sort of verbs you can use with it. So there are selectional restrictions between verbs and their arguments, different ones. So for example, you can't, let's see, if you have something like, freedom was afraid, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? It's not the sort of thing that freedom can do. So things like verbs, well, I guess it's an adjective, but you know what I mean? Imagine a verb. How about I kicked freedom? That's a better one. You can't kick freedom, like it's not an object. So there's some restrictions on selectional restrictions on which verbs as well, if we want to look at those. So we pulled out the collocations here using a dependency parser, including verbs and AMOD, so basically the direct objects, subject, and also indirect objects. And we wanted to measure like the strength of the relationship between these things. However, adjectives and verbs are not the only things in a noun's context that might belie the meaning. since we wanted to look across the whole corpus, we weren't exactly sure the size of the effects that we might see. So we wanted also to have like a lower bound, floor, that we don't expect any effect from, just so we know whether the effects we do see are like of a reasonable size to be interpretable. So we looked a bit more at other sorts of grammatical markers like number and case, which presumably have no relation to grammatical gender. So it's not, at least it's hard to imagine that feminine nouns would be more pluralizable than masculine nouns, or would come in different cases. It seems a bit unexpected. So we checked for that as sort of a floor. So all this set out, you probably are wondering, how do we actually measure information? We use mutual information, which is an information theoretic quantity that does basically correlation. We wanted to see if gender interacts with meaning, given sort of like, does it decrease the entropy over choice of adjective or choice of gender to know the other? That's like the main question that mutual information allows you to answer. So if you have some amount of entropy over adjectives in a corpus, if you know the gender of the noun that the adjective modifies, do you have less entropy? The answer is you either have the same amount or less, right? And mutual information is the amount by which the entropy is decreased. So it's a measure of correlation. So in order to kind of make that measure of correlation a bit more interpretable, we also normalize it, so you get a percentage. You can think of the result that I'm about to show you as a percentage of entropy reduced, which is similar to how much information you get about the relationship between the two. Okay, if mutual information between the two quantities is significantly greater than 0, they are correlated, they're not independent. That's a kind of a one-sentence summary. So a few experimental details for those of you who are excited about mutual information. We use the empirical estimates from the Wikipedia corpora and just plug those in. So the probabilities of the words from Wikipedia. There are other things we could do, but we kind of did that as an initial first step. And to get significance, we randomly regendered all the nouns that we had. So if it had been, let's say, a feminine noun in German, we would just give it either neuter or masculine. And then we did that a bunch of times, I think it was 10,000 times, to create a distribution. And then we used that kind of as a non-parametric test for significance. Wanted to see if our empirical sample fell past the 95% of the distribution. Okay. All right, so results. I kind of already gave away the punchline. There's a relationship, but the relationship holds across all of the languages we surveyed, and it's slightly different amounts of entropy reduction depending on the language, but it's around 8 to 11% across the board. So there is a measurable, and it's statistically significant. So there is a measurable and significant relationship between gender on nouns and the adjectives that modify those nouns. We found also significant relationships for verbs and the gender on their subjects, and verbs and the gender on the direct objects. These, at least for the subjects, it was only significant for 4 of the 6 languages. For verbs, it was significant for all. And the magnitude of these effects, it was pretty big for direct objects,